Don't touch that piano. The voice cut through the room, sharp and effortless like it belonged there, like everything in this mansion did except him. A few guests turned, their laughter low and polished, the kind that never needed to be loud to feel cruel. Ethan Cole paused with his hand hovering just inches above the ivory keys, worn work boots planted on a floor that probably cost more than his truck. "I'm just here to fix it," he said quietly. "Then fix it," another man muttered, sipping from crystal glass, "not pretend you can play it." The laughter followed again, softer this time, more certain. Ethan nodded once, slow, respectful, like a man who understood his place in a room that had already decided who he was. The chandelier above cast a warm gold light across polished marble, across tailored suits and silk dresses, across faces that didn't see him. Not really. Just a worker. Just a pair of hands. Just someone who would leave when the job was done. He set his worn toolbox gently on the bench beside the piano, the leather creaking faintly, the only sound that didn't belong to wealth or status. The instrument itself stood tall, black lacquer gleaming under the lights. A grand piano worth more than most homes, its lid open like a silent challenge. Ethan exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the wood, feeling the faint vibration of a space that hadn't heard real music in a long time. "It's out of tune," he said. "Obviously," the same voice replied, impatient now. "That's why you're here." Ethan gave a small nod, then leaned closer, adjusting a string, tightening, listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something practiced, something quiet. The room buzzed behind him, conversations rising and falling like waves, glasses clinking, heels tapping, the hum of a world that never had to notice men like him. But his fingers slowed, then stopped, then rested lightly on the keys. "Hey," someone called out, sharper this time. "We said fix it." Ethan didn't answer. His shoulders remained still, his posture calm, like a man standing in a place he used to belong to but chose to leave behind. One key pressed. Just one. A soft note, barely louder than a breath. Then another, and another. The sound didn't fight the room. It slipped into it. Quiet. Steady. Certain. Conversations faltered, not all at once, but enough to be noticed. A woman near the window turned her head. A glass paused midair. Somewhere a heel stopped tapping. Ethan didn't look up. He just played, slow and deliberate. Each note placed with care, like he was remembering something he never truly forgot. The laughter faded. Not forced. Not commanded. Just gone. And for the first time that night, the room didn't feel rich. It felt still. The last note lingered in the air longer than it should have. Soft but undeniable. Like it had found a place inside the room that no amount of money could fill. And for a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. No one even dared to interrupt what they did not understand. Then a quiet voice broke through the stillness. "Play that again." It said, not loud, not demanding, just certain. And Ethan's fingers hovered above the keys before slowly pulling back, as if the moment itself had never belonged to him. "I am here to fix the piano," he replied calmly, his voice steady, his eyes still lowered. But the room had changed, and everyone felt it. The same man who laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably. "That was not fixing," he said, trying to reclaim control. "That was showing off." A few forced chuckles followed, but they did not land the same way. Not anymore, because something deeper had already taken hold. Something quiet and unshakable. Ethan reached for his tuning tool again, adjusting a string with precise care, each movement deliberate, each sound measured, like a man who respected the craft more than the audience. But footsteps approached, slow and confident, heels clicking softly against marble, and when Ethan finally looked up, he saw her for the first time clearly. Victoria Hale stood just a few feet away, her presence commanding without effort, her expression composed, but her eyes no longer distant. They were searching, studying, almost remembering. "What was that piece?" she asked, her voice calm, but carrying something beneath it, something real. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, then answered simply, "Just something I used to play." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze not leaving him. "People do not just play like that," she said, not as a question, but as a truth. The room leaned in again, not physically, but in attention, drawn by something they could not name. Ethan returned his focus to the piano, tightening another pin, letting the silence stretch just enough before speaking again. "People stop playing," he said quietly. And that was all. But it was enough because it carried weight. It carried history. It carried the kind of dignity that did not need explanation. Victoria's expression softened almost imperceptibly, like a crack in something perfectly controlled. "Why did you stop?" she asked, softer now, and for the first time. Ethan's hands paused completely, resting lightly on the instrument as if it were something fragile, something personal. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes from years of holding things in place. "Because some things matter more," he said, and he did not elaborate. He did not need to. The room felt it again, that shift, that quiet gravity. One guest whispered under his breath, "Who is this guy?" But no one answered, because the truth was beginning to reveal itself, not in words, but in presence, in restraint, in the way a man could stand in a room full of power and not ask for any of it. And Victoria Hale, a woman who had built an empire on control and precision, realized in that moment that this was not about a piano, and it was not about a repair. It was about something she had not felt in years, something money could not buy, something that had just walked into her world in worn boots and quiet hands. And for the first time that night, she did not see a worker. She saw a man she could not easily define, and that unsettled her more than anything else. The room did not return to what it was, not after that moment, not after the silence had settled into something heavier than noise. And even as conversations slowly tried to resume, they came back softer, uncertain, like people adjusting to a truth they had not expected to witness. Ethan continued his work without looking up, tightening, listening, adjusting again, each movement steady, disciplined, as if the world around him had no authority over what his hands knew how to do. But Victoria did not step away. She remained there watching, not as a host observing a hired man, but as someone trying to understand something that did not fit into any category she controlled. "How long will it take?" she asked, her voice measured but quieter than before. Ethan glanced briefly at the strings before answering. "About 20 minutes, he said. "It depends how long it has been left like this." She nodded slowly, her eyes shifting to the piano, then back to him. "Longer than it should have been," she replied, and there was something in that sentence that was not about the instrument, something personal, something unspoken. Ethan did not respond, but his hands slowed just enough to acknowledge that he had heard it. Across the room, a man cleared his throat, trying again to reclaim attention. "Victoria, we were discussing the expansion deal," he said, forcing a confident smile. "You should not be distracted by this." A few heads nodded, eager to return to familiar ground, to numbers and control and predictable outcomes. But Victoria did not move. Her gaze remained fixed. "The deal can wait," she said simply. And that was enough to silence them again, not because of the words, but because of the shift in priority. Something had taken precedence over billions of dollars, and no one in that room was used to that. Ethan adjusted the final pin and pressed a single key, then another, testing, listening, the sound now clear, balanced, restored. "It is done," he said, stepping back slightly, but before he could reach for his tools again, Victoria spoke. "Play it," she said, and this time there was no challenge in her voice, no control, just a quiet request, the kind that does not demand but still cannot be ignored. Ethan hesitated just for a second. The room held its breath again, waiting, watching, measuring. He looked down at the keys, then at his hands, worn but steady, and something shifted inside him. Not hesitation, not fear, just memory, just one piece. Someone whispered from across the room, half curious, half unsure. Ethan exhaled slowly and sat down, not like a performer, not like someone trying to impress, but like a man returning to something he once belonged to. His fingers rested on the keys, still for a moment, then moved, soft at first, almost hesitant, but the notes came together quickly, naturally, like they had been waiting. The melody rose, gentle but certain, filling the space not with sound but with presence. Conversation stopped again, glasses lowered. Even the air seemed to pause. Victoria did not blink her expression, no longer controlled but open, vulnerable in a way she had not allowed in years, because what she was hearing was not skill. It was truth. It was sacrifice. It was something earned in silence. And as the music unfolded, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was not a man who fixed pianos. This was a man who had given something up, something rare, something valuable, and chose not to speak about it. And that realization settled deeper than any note he played. The final note did not end so much as it dissolved, slipping into the air like it belonged there, like it had always been waiting for a reason to exist again, and no one moved. Not immediately, because something about the way Ethan played did not invite applause. It invited reflection, and that was far more uncomfortable for people who were used to reacting instead of feeling. A man near the bar cleared his throat. "That was impressive," he said, the words sounding smaller than he intended. Another guest nodded quickly. Yes, very talented, but their voices lacked conviction because they were not responding to performance. They were reacting to something they could not measure. Ethan slowly lifted his hands from the keys, his posture unchanged, calm, grounded, like nothing extraordinary had just happened. He stood, reaching for his toolbox again. "The piano is tuned," he said simply, as if that was all this had ever been. Victoria did not respond right away, her eyes still fixed on him, searching, not for answers, but for truth. "You walked away from it," she said quietly, not asking, stating. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded once. "Yes," he replied. No explanation, no defense, just truth. The room leaned in again, drawn to the silence between his words. "People do not leave something like that," she continued, her voice softer now, less controlled. "Not without a reason." Ethan closed his toolbox slowly, the latch clicking into place with a finality that echoed more than it should have. "I had one," he said, "and that was all, but it carried weight, it carried years, it carried choices that could not be undone." Across the room someone whispered, "What could possibly be worth that?" But no one answered because the answer was already there, not spoken but felt. Victoria took a small step closer, something in her composure shifting, not breaking, but softening. "And now," she asked, "do you ever regret it?" The question lingered in the air, heavier than before, more personal than anything that had been said that night. Ethan looked at the piano, then at his hands, then finally at her, his expression calm, steady, unshaken. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, just certainty, the kind that does not come from success, but from sacrifice made with purpose. The room went quiet again, not because they were told to be, but because they did not know how to respond to something so simple and so complete. Victoria studied him, really studied him now, not as a businessman evaluates a deal, but as a person trying to understand another soul. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar, something that did not fit into contracts or strategies or outcomes, something that could not be controlled, respected, or bought. "Stay," she said suddenly. The words soft but clear, and it cut through the room more effectively than any command she had ever given. A few guests exchanged glances, surprised, confused, because this was not how she operated. This was not how her world worked. Ethan met her gaze, not intimidated, not impressed, just present. "I have work in the morning," he replied calmly, not dismissive, just honest. And that answer landed differently than anything else that night, because it did not bend, it did not seek approval, it simply existed. And in that moment, Victoria realized something she had not expected. Power did not always belong to the person who owned the room. Sometimes it belonged to the one who could walk away from it without losing himself. And that realization stayed with her long after the music had faded. The room did not recover, even after he spoke, because something about the way Ethan refused without resistance unsettled them more than any display of talent ever could. He was not rejecting her. He was not challenging her. He was simply choosing his life, and that quiet certainty echoed louder than any performance. Victoria held his gaze a moment longer, studying the calm in his eyes, the absence of need, the absence of ambition for anything she could offer. And that was new. That was unfamiliar. "What kind of work?" she asked her. Tone softer now, no longer the voice of a woman used to being obeyed, but someone trying to understand. Ethan adjusted the handle of his toolbox. "Auto shop," He said, simple, direct, 7:30 in the morning. A faint murmur moved through the guests, not mocking this time, but confused, as if they could not reconcile the man they had just witnessed with the life he described. One man whispered, "You are telling me he fixes cars." Another shook his head slightly, unable to process it. But Ethan did not react. He did not explain. He did not defend. He simply stood there as he was. And that was enough. Victoria glanced briefly at the piano, then back at him, something shifting behind her composed expression. "You gave that up," she said again, quieter this time, almost to herself, "for that life." Ethan followed her gaze for a second, then nodded once. "For my daughter," he replied, and the room stilled again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that settled deeper than before, because now it made sense, not in a way they could relate to, but in a way they could not ignore. A woman near the back lowered her glass slowly. Another guest exhaled under his breath. Something about that answer stripped away every assumption they had made about him. And in its place was something they did not have, something they could not buy, something that did not need to prove itself. Victoria's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders easing, her voice losing the last edge of control. "How old is she?" she asked. Ethan's expression softened just enough to be noticed. 9, he said, and that single word carried warmth that had not appeared anywhere else in him that night. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Does she know," she continued, "what you gave up?" Ethan paused, just briefly, then shook his head. "She knows I am there," he said. "That is enough." Silence followed again. But this time it was not heavy. It was reflective, like the room itself had been invited to reconsider what mattered. One of the earlier voices, quieter now, said, "That is respectable." But even that felt insufficient, because respect was not something Ethan had asked for, and it was not something he needed to hear. He reached for the strap of his toolbox again, preparing to leave, but Victoria stepped slightly closer, not blocking him, not stopping him, just present. "What would it take?" she asked carefully, choosing her words with a precision she rarely needed. "For you to play again?" The question hung in the air, fragile, honest, stripped of power. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, and there was no hesitation, no calculation, just clarity. "Nothing," he said, and that answer did not close a door. It revealed one, because it meant he had not lost it. He had not abandoned it. He had simply chosen something greater, and that truth settled into Victoria Hale deeper than any business deal ever had, because for the first time in a very long time, she was not thinking about what she could offer, she was thinking about what she had been missing. The air shifted again, but this time it did not belong to the room. It followed him as he turned, as if something unseen refused to let the moment in so easily. Ethan adjusted his grip on the toolbox and stepped away from the piano, each step steady, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly where he belonged and where he did not. "You are just going to leave?" A voice called out from behind him, not mocking this time, but uncertain, almost reluctant. Ethan paused but did not turn around. "Immediately. That is what I was hired to do," he replied calmly. Then took another step, but Victoria's voice followed, softer yet impossible to ignore. "Ethan," she said, and the way she said his name changed everything. Not as an employer, not as a billionaire, but as someone who had just learned something she did not want to lose. He stopped, turning just enough to face her again. The room watched silent, not because they were told to be, but because they did not want to break whatever this was becoming. Victoria took a step closer, her composure no longer perfect, no longer untouched. "You said nothing would make you play again," she said, her voice measured but carrying something deeper now. "But you still did." Ethan met her gaze, steady as before. "I did not play for them," he said quietly. "I played because it was already there." The words settled between them, simple but undeniable. Victoria glanced briefly at the piano, then back at him. "And now," she asked, "will you just walk away from it again?" Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes shifting for the first time, not uncertain, but thoughtful, like a man weighing something that had not been asked in a long time. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I never walked away from it," he said finally. "I just chose when it mattered." A quiet breath moved through the room, not quite a reaction, more like recognition, because that was something they did not understand, not fully victorious. Expressions softened again, the tension in her posture easing into something more human, more real. Then maybe it matters now, she said, not as a command, not as a negotiation, but as a possibility. Ethan studied her for a moment, not her wealth, not her position, just her, and for the first time there was a shift in him, not visible to most, but present like a door opening just slightly. It matters differently, he replied, and that was enough to stop the conversation from becoming something transactional, because whatever this was, it could not be bought, it could not be negotiated, it could only be understood or not. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing that, respecting it in a way she had not expected to respect anything that night. Behind her the guests remained still, no one interrupting, no one stepping in, because the power in the room had shifted again. And this time it did not belong to status or wealth. It belonged to truth. Ethan adjusted the strap of his toolbox once more, but this time when he turned to leave, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like something unfinished, something that had just begun to take shape. And Victoria Hale, standing in a room she had always controlled, realized that for the first time in years, she was not trying to win. She was trying to understand, and that changed everything. The door did not close loudly when Ethan stepped out, but somehow the absence of him echoed louder than anything that had happened inside. And for a moment no one spoke, because they all felt it, the shift, the loss of something they had only just begun to understand. One guest cleared his throat. "Well," he said, trying to bring the room back to something familiar. "That was unexpected," but the word fell flat, because nothing about what they had witnessed fit into expectation anymore. Victoria did not move, her eyes still fixed on the space where Ethan had been, as if the silence he left behind was something she needed to listen to, not fill. "Resume the meeting," the same man added, more firmly now, eager to restore order, to return to numbers and negotiations. But Victoria did not respond immediately, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the piano, tracing the polished surface as if it held something more than sound. "Cancel it," she said, quietly, and that single decision sent a ripple through the room stronger than any raised voice ever could. "Cancel it," the man repeated, confused. "Victoria, this deal is worth over $200 million, she nodded once, calm, certain. "Then it will still be there tomorrow," she replied. And that was the end of it, because no one in that room had ever heard her speak like that before. Not dismissive, not impulsive, just clear, like she had already made a choice that mattered more. The guests began to shift, uncertain, gathering their things, murmuring softly as they left, not because they were dismissed, but because they no longer belonged to the moment. And soon the room that had once been filled with status and noise grew quiet again. But this silence was different. It was intentional. Victoria stood alone beside the piano, her reflection faint in its black surface. And for the first time in years, she was not thinking about expansion or strategy or control. She was thinking about a man who had none of those things, and yet had something she could not define, something she could not replicate, something she could not ignore. She reached out and pressed a single key. The note rang clear, perfectly tuned, but it felt empty. Not wrong, just incomplete, like it needed something more than precision. She exhaled slowly, then turned, walking toward the large windows overlooking the city. The skyline stretched endlessly, lights glowing across miles of wealth and ambition, everything she had built, everything she controlled. And yet none of it had ever made a room go silent the way he had. Her assistant stepped quietly into the doorway, hesitant. "Do you need anything?" she asked softly. Victoria did not turn, her eyes still on the city. "Find him," she said, her voice calm but certain. The assistant blinked slightly. "The technician," she clarified. Victoria shook her head slowly. "No," she said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. The man, and that difference mattered more than anything else that had been said that night, because it was not about a service anymore. It was not about a transaction. It was about something real, something human, something she had almost forgotten existed, and somewhere across the city. Ethan Cole drove home in a worn truck that rattled slightly at every stoplight, unaware that the quiet dignity he carried had just changed the direction of a woman who had everything except what he refused to sell. And for the first time in a very long time, two completely different worlds had begun to move toward each other, not through force, not through need, but through something far more rare, something built in silence. The city had not changed by morning, but something inside it had, or maybe it was just the way one man moved through it without needing anything from it. Ethan pulled his truck into the small auto shop just before 7:30, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, the same sound it made every day, predictable, steady. Honest, he stepped out, grabbing his toolbox from the passenger seat, the morning air cool against his skin, carrying the faint smell of oil and asphalt, a world far removed. From marble floors and crystal glasses, "You are early," a voice called out from inside. It was Mike leaning over the hood of a sedan, wiping his hands on a rag. Ethan nodded once. "Same as always," he replied, setting his tools down. Nothing in his tone suggested that anything had changed, because for him, nothing had, not yet, but across town, things were moving differently. Victoria stood in her office, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline, her assistant speaking quickly, listing names, locations, possibilities. "We have located 3 technicians named Ethan Cole within a 50-mile radius," she said. 2 are retired. 1 works at a small auto repair shop on the west side. Victoria did not hesitate. "That is him," she said, not based on data, not based on logic, but on something quieter, something certain. "Should I schedule a meeting?" the assistant asked, already reaching for her tablet. Victoria shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "I will go." And that decision alone said more than any strategy ever could, because she was not sending for him. She was going to him. Back at the shop, Ethan worked in silence, tightening bolts, checking fluid levels, his movements efficient, practiced, grounded in a life built on consistency, not recognition. A customer waited nearby, watching him work. "You have done this a long time," the man said casually. Ethan nodded. "Long enough," he replied, not offering more, because he never needed to explain himself to strangers. But the sound of a car pulling up broke the rhythm of the morning. Not loud, not dramatic, just different, the kind of difference that made people look up without knowing why. A sleek black car stopped just outside the shop, out of place against the faded sign and worn pavement. Mike glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "That does not belong here," he muttered, but Ethan did not look right away. He finished tightening the last bolt before straightening, wiping his hands slowly, then turning, and when he saw her step out, everything paused. Not the world, not the city, just the space between them. Victoria walked toward him without hesitation. No security, no entourage, just her, dressed simply but unmistakably out of place in this environment. The gravel shifted beneath her heels, but she did not slow down. "You found me," Ethan said calmly, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what was in front of him. Victoria stopped a few feet away, meeting his gaze, the noise of the shop fading into the background. "I did not come for the piano," she said, her voice steady but carrying something more honest than before. "Then why are you here?" he asked. And the question was not defensive. It was real, because he did not assume anything about her. Not her intentions, not her reasons. Victoria held his gaze, no longer guarded, no longer calculating. "Because you left something unfinished," she said quietly. And for the first time since she had entered his world, there was no power in her words, only truth, and that made all the difference. The words settled between them with a quiet weight. Not dramatic, not urgent, just undeniable, and Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes steady on hers, measuring not her status, not her presence, but the truth behind what she said. "Unfinished," he repeated softly, as if testing whether the word belonged to him or to her. Victoria nodded once, not pushing, not explaining, just standing there in a place that clearly was not built for her world, and yet she did not seem uncomfortable, only certain. "You played," she said, her voice calm, "and then you left like it did not matter." Ethan wiped his hands slowly with a clean cloth, the motion deliberate, grounded. "It mattered," he replied, "just not the way you think." The sounds of the shop continued around them, tools clinking, engines humming, but none of it touched the space they stood in, because something quieter had taken over, something more real. Victoria took a small breath, not out of frustration, but out of recognition. Then show me, she said, and there was no demand in it. No expectation of control, just a simple request that carried more honesty than anything she had said before. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head gently. This is not a stage, he said, glancing briefly around the shop, at the oil stains, the worn concrete, the tools laid out with care, and I am not performing. Victoria did not argue. She did not push back. She only stepped slightly closer, her voice softer now. I am not asking you to perform, she said. I am asking you not to disappear. And that was different. That was something he had not expected, the kind of request that did not come from power, but from something much more vulnerable. Ethan's expression shifted just slightly, not visibly to most, but enough to show that. The words had reached him. I never disappeared, he said quietly. I just chose where I belong. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing that, respecting it, but not stepping away. And where is that? She asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. Ethan glanced toward the open garage door where sunlight spilled across the pavement, then back at her. Right here, he said, simple, steady, complete. The answer settled into the air, and for a moment it felt like an ending, like a boundary. Clearly drawn, but something in Victoria did not retreat. Something in her had already crossed that line. Then let me stand here, she said, and the words were quiet, almost lost in the hum of the shop, but they carried more meaning than anything else that had been spoken between them. Ethan did not answer immediately. He studied her, not her clothes, not her presence, just her, and what he saw was not the woman from the night before, not the one surrounded by power and expectation, but someone who had chosen to step out of that world without hesitation, without protection, just to understand something she could not buy. And that mattered. More than he expected it to, more than he wanted to admit. He exhaled slowly, the tension not leaving, but shifting. It is not an easy place to stand, he said. And it was not a warning. It was truth. Victoria's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer, more certain. Neither is yours, she replied. And that was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way real things do. Because for the first time, they were not standing in separate worlds trying to reach each other. They were standing in the same place. Without roles, without titles, just two people facing something honest. And in that space, there was no audience, no expectation, no performance, only silence. And for the first time since the music had faded, that silence did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something that did not need to be explained to be understood.